Well, welcome to Policy Exchange. My name is Guy Newey. I'm Head of Environment and Energy here, and a warm welcome. This is a fabulous turnout, and we're delighted to see so many of you here. For those of you who don't know who Policy Exchange are and what we do, we're a think tank based here in Westminster. We publish an endless flurry of research on a wide range of topics, and host what we hope are interesting and informative debates, and I'm sure that's the case today. Within the Environment and Energy Unit, we're focused on meeting kind of important environmental goals as cost effectively as possible, be it climate targets or protection of our important natural environment. So we're holding this debate today, and I have noticed we're one short on the panel. We'll get to that in a moment. We are holding this debate on securing the value of nature a year on from the release of Defra's Natural Environment White Paper. For us at Policy Exchange, it was a very important step forward in efforts to raise the importance of protection of the natural environment in policy making. At its centre was an effort to ensure that the value of our natural environment, our habitats, our wildlife, our endangered species, was better represented in decisions we made about how we use land. It also called for the use of the best possible data, and something we supported in our recent paper, Nurturing Nature, which was available on your seats, but I'm told has run out. So anyone who needs an extra copy, come and grab me at the end, and I'm sure we'll be able to help you out. But one of the things we called for in the paper was a central registry of planning agreements that deal with biodiversity protection. We argue that better data collection, as long as many of the other measures recommended in the Natural Environment White Paper, which we'll discuss today, would help allow civil society to ensure that the mechanisms we have in the planning system and other systems to protect nature are working properly and that they're properly scrutinised. So at the same time as we've had progress in the UK, we've also had a buzz of activity on the international stage, and of course most notably the recent Rio plus 2020 summit. Today we're hoping to discuss what progress has been made from following those two important pillars, both domestically and internationally. And we also want to try and explore the wider issues of how the value of nature is properly accounted for in decision making, and how we can best direct resources to make sure they deliver the biggest biodiversity bang for our buck. We have the perfect panel to discuss this, or at least 3/4 of the perfect panel to discuss this. Our first speaker will be Caroline Spelman, who you all know as Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. She's been a Member of Parliament for Meriden since 1997, following a career in agricultural policy and consultancy, and she took over her role following the last election, which already 2 years ago. Our second speaker will be Dieter Helm, Professor of Energy Policy at Oxford University. He's well known to Policy Exchange and has indeed authored several of our reports in the past. He's here today in his capacity as chair of the Natural Capital Committee, which is tasked with providing independent advice on the state of England's natural assets. Our third speaker is Professor Georgina Mace, who is Professor of Conservation Science at Imperial College. She's a member of the Lawton panel, which produced what I think was the wonderful Making Space for Nature report, which has informed so much government policy and indeed our own thinking in this area. She's also involved in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. The fourth member of our panel, as the eagle-eyed of you will have noticed, is not yet here. Richard Benyon is caught in traffic, we think, after getting stuck on a train, and he's got a good excuse. I think this morning he was in Gateshead, where he was opening up the River Derwent to allow salmon and trout to swim up it for the first time in 300 years. So it's a reasonable excuse for being late. We hope he's going to be here by 4 o'clock, just in time to make his speech. I'd also like to point out that Policy Exchange has a report on air quality and air pollution, so maybe he'll be very susceptible to that if the reason for his delay has been a taxi protest. but I'll leave that for the hymn. For those of you who violently agree or disagree with what you hear on the panel, I'd ask you to wait patiently for questions. We should have a good half an hour at the end, at least, to tackle any issues that you think are important, following what we've said. But if you cannot wait for that, you can vent your anger or delight by tweeting, and the hashtag is valuing nature. Secretary of State.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, when Richard does arrive, if anyone manages to tell him that he shall achieve perfection when Mr. Benyon arrives. So I'm sure he'd love to know that. Dear man, he works so hard, and I know that he will be anxious to get here. So I look forward to him arriving. I may have to make the announcements he was going to make, because it's important that you know what he was going to say. So you may get them twice, from me and from Richard Yates. So first of all, thank you very much to Policy Exchange for this opportunity to assess the progress and celebrate the achievements of the Natural Environment White Paper. You say that it was very important for you. It was very important for us. The White Paper, the first in 20 years, was a bold and ambitious statement, and it needed to be. We can't shy away from the gravity or the urgency of the challenges we face. Now I've got one of these rare copies now of Nurturing Nature, Policy Exchange own report, that states that the international loss of species and habitats is being characterised as the 6th mass extinction facing our planet. In the UK, 11 out of 15 of our most important types of habitat are in decline. So that's why it's so urgent. I'm very proud of the lead that this country is taking in the face of this challenge. Guys, right, I've recently returned from Rio +20, where the UK worked very hard to set the international community on track. And despite rather negative reports, we did make important progress. First and foremost, a universal recognition of the importance of the green economy for sustainable growth and the eradication of poverty. Also vital, the agreement on sustainable development goals. And I think Rio will be one of those moments that the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And when we look back, we will mark these sustainable development goals having been agreed in principle in 2012. The urgent need to protect our seas and oceans was recognised with the call for agreement on protecting the high seas, so extending conservation beyond territorial waters into the high seas. There was a universal pledge to protect forests and increase reforestation, and the universal call for business to report on their sustainability performance, as championed by the UK delegation and UK businesses. So I'm very proud that corporate accounting for sustainability is in the agreement. And universal recognition that the value of natural capital and of social well-being must be factored into all our decisions. Now, Rio showed that there is political ambition for change. Now we have to make sure that it's not squandered. And we're already making headway. And the UK is showing strong leadership internationally and at home. The UK is both a champion and a leader on GDP+, which is about widening the definition of GDP to include natural and social capital. Later this month, the Office of National Statistics will be launching a consultation on a roadmap for including natural capital in the UK environmental accounts, a commitment in the NUP. This will help us properly value our own natural assets and shows that on the Rio commitment that the UK is ahead of the game. Now, I'm delighted that Dieter agreed to chair our Natural Capital Committee, and he will be speaking to you shortly about the work of his committee, which is already underway. And published today are the interim findings of the Ecosystem Markets Task Force, chaired by Ian Cheshire. The task force draws together a wealth of experience to identify the most promising business opportunities in green markets, goods and services. We also launched the Green Genius, or Greenius contest in Rio with funding of £3 million. Now, this will be delivered by the Technology Strategy Board, and it's a national competition for innovations that help homes and businesses save money as well as reduce the amount of resource they use. Aimed at small and medium-sized enterprises, it'll help us drive forward our green growth agenda. Also today, the government has submitted its response to the Environmental Audit Select Committee's report on the green economy. And our response makes it clear that our vision for a green economy is not just about expanding the low carbon and environmental goods and services sectors, but about transforming the whole economy. It sets out the framework for this transformation and the actions we're taking right now, including action on greenhouse gas reporting and on sustainable development indicators, as well as how we're taking forward the outcomes from Rio. And Rio was a vital moment, a turning point, but it doesn't begin and end with Rio. Rio was one of a series of international staging posts, the next of which is the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference in Hyderabad in October. The UK played a highly influential role at the Nagoya meeting of the Convention in 2010, and we're now working hard to ensure the momentum is maintained at Hyderabad and beyond. That's why we've established a high-level panel with India to estimate the global investment needed to implement the ambitious strategic plan for biodiversity by 2020 agreed at Nagoya. It's vital that the UK and all developed nations continue to show international leadership and to support poorer nations to protect biodiversity. Now at Rio, I announced round 19 of the Darwin scheme, originally set up at the original Earth Summit. We've now reached round 19, and that was worth £7.5 million. Today, I can announce, in addition, an additional £400,000 for smaller projects under the Darwin Initiative Challenge Fund, which will help groups around the world to protect threatened species and ecosystems. I'm also delighted to announce that the UK is the first country to confirm its membership of the new Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, otherwise known in shorthand as IPBES. The new body will be tremendously important in ensuring that decisions to protect global biodiversity are based on the best scientific knowledge available. And I think it's right just to pay tribute to Defra's own chief scientist, Professor Sir Bob Watson, who's played such an important role there in the setting up of IPBES and getting to the important meeting chaired in Panama this year. We intend to be active participants and will contribute £1.6 million over the next 3 years to support the work of IPBES. Bit of water, please. Thank you very much. Developed nations must also show leadership in meeting their Nagoya commitments at home, which means taking practical actions to value and enhance our stocks of natural capital and to mainstream biodiversity. Mainstreaming biodiversity considerations into all relevant sectors, including forestry, agriculture and energy, will be critical if we're going to achieve those targets we agreed to in Nagoya. Again, the UK is ahead of the game. Our UK National Ecosystem Assessment was the bedrock of the Natural Environment White Paper, and through Georgina I pay tribute to the scientists, almost 200 of them, that gave up their time and effort to help us develop that National Ecosystem Assessment, which is a quite groundbreaking scientific tool to help us really estimate the value of natural capital. We also have Sir John Lawton's invaluable report, Making Space for Nature, as Guy mentioned, and to which the white paper responded with nature improvement areas and local nature partnerships. I was really delighted to see how much enthusiasm that generated. I was with John Lawton when we were launching one of these nature improvement areas in the Black Country, in a small area of green space, nestled right in the middle of the heart of the Midlands industrial landscape. And the enthusiasm amongst local people to see this area of green space, biodiversity protected and enhanced was just something that I'm never going to forget. And it sort of leads me really neatly into being able to, I suppose, trail Richard's announcement. I hope he gets a chance to say this twice because it's exciting. That I'm delighted to announce that 41 partnerships, local nature partnerships, are today earning official recognition as their local nature partnerships. And I'm looking forward to meeting them at a summit in the autumn. But one of the things we learnt about launching nature improvement areas is the enthusiasm out there vastly exceeds, the resources that we would like to put behind all the projects. So learning from that, another thing that Richard will perhaps also announce today, but I think it's right to underline, is that we're going to commit an additional £750,000 to support the proposals that reached the final stage of the competition but did not make the winning 12. Because that's recognition that there is so much enthusiasm out there that you actually want to recognise that with some resource towards those who really would like to achieve the local nature partnership status. And hopefully you'll recognise in that the goodwill that the government is manifesting towards that huge enthusiasm there is out there for protecting and enhancing nature. He'll say more about this even when he does arrive. Now, I believe the Natural Environment White Paper was a really aspirational document. It needed to be, and it mirrors the aspirations of its contributors, my own included, the governments, and the aspirations, I think, of everyone I can see in this room. Its testament to this ambition is the commendation of the White Paper by the Defra Select Committee in its report published today. I'm grateful for that. I'd like to thank the committee chair, who's with us today, and we will be considering the recommendations of her committee very carefully and publish our response to them in the autumn. The committee highlighted the critical role of the wider public sector, business, communities and markets, all of whom are needed to deliver the Natural Environment White Paper's ambitions. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I'm delighted with this level of engagement right across all sectors and with the progress that's been made. Let's be proud of what we've been doing and let's keep it going. Thank you.
Let me begin by thanking the Policy Exchange for inviting me to speak at this event. As I think was said, I've had quite a relationship with the Policy Exchange over a number of years and done work on carbon taxes and infrastructure with the Policy Exchange. And their latest contribution, which was also mentioned, contributes to that continuing engagement in public policy, which is so valuable. In the few minutes available to me, I wanted to set a little bit of context which echoes some of the things that the Secretary of State has said. I want to introduce you to the Natural Capital Committee, what it is and what it isn't, and I want to spend a little time just outlining the main tasks we have in front of us and to outline what it is that we intend to achieve. Context first. Biodiversity, the natural environment, feels sometimes a bit like climate change was about a decade or so ago. Everyone thought, oh, there's a bit of a problem, but it was an add-on or additional problem while other more important things were dealt with. Then in the climate change world, along came people like Nick Stern and set about integrating the climate change problem into the core of economic activity. And although personally I have lots of reservations about the details of the Stern Review, which I've written about in lots of occasions, there's no doubt whatsoever that climate change stepped up a major gear once it was treated as an integral part of the economy and not an add-on. And it feels to me, and it's one of the reasons why I'm really delighted to take on chairing the Natural Capital Committee, that we're at one of those moments with biodiversity and natural capital more generally. The Secretary of State mentioned the scale of the international problem. The very idea that it's even remotely possible that half the species on the planet get extinguished by the end of this century is so horrifyingly awful that you would think it would be top automatically of the agenda. That destruction of biodiversity is going on at an enormous rate, and nobody in their right mind could possibly think that current practices in a whole range of contexts are anything like sustainable. It can't go on like that. It indeed won't go on like that without major consequences. And one of the reasons why it's been allowed to go on so long is because effectively nobody's been prepared to put positive value on our environment and our environmental assets, to take them seriously. And indeed, in most cases, what actually happens is because people shy away from the idea that we ought to value nature, that effectively it has a price of zero. And that's indeed how we've been treating it. So valuation is extraordinarily important. It's limited, it's about resource allocation, it's about how much we should devote to looking after these assets. It's not about intrinsic value, it's not about aesthetic value, it's just being economically cold, hard and ruthless about making sure that we don't go around valuing the environment at zero. And paragraph 2 of the executive summary of the white paper puts valuation right up front. That, it seems to me, in 10 or 15 years' time will be looked back on as a turning point in the way we tried to address the natural environment. And that's what, to me, is so important about the white paper, among lots of other things. Now, things are not going well internationally at the biodiversity level, and nobody can reasonably argue that we have been treating our own environment here in a sustainable way. You can argue about the things that have gone right and the things that have gone wrong, but I'm not that old, but over my lifetime the world is very different from how I remember it as a child on a farm in Essex and seeing what elm trees and diversity really look like. This is important because one of our tasks, and the remit which I'll come on to in a moment, is to advise the Economic Affairs Committee of when assets are being used unsustainably. So this position and this recognition that we cannot go on treating assets as if they're valued as zero, and this recognition that we have to address unsustainable practice is now core to one part of the creation of the white paper. And we all know lots of examples, whether it be in any of the particular domains that particular groups are interested in, from agriculture to the burning of peat, which I saw in the Outer Hebrides to address the energy prices, through to all sorts of land use and water and marine environmental examples. And forestry is another one which has come up to the frame. Now, that's a backdrop of the need to take things seriously. The government, this government and the previous government have started on the process of trying to not only stop the rot, but make active progress to improving our natural environment. The Lawton Report is an ambitious, proactive, positive contribution of how we can make things better rather than the usual how do we stop things getting worse. And it provides a vision which lots of people have been able to organise around, and indeed the white paper is written in that context. The NEA, which has been referred to, is an enormous step forward in progress, and the asset check work which is going to emerge out of that gives us a much more fine-grained understanding of our natural environment. Now, into this context comes the Natural Capital Committee. It is independent, fiercely independent. It is multidisciplinary. It has, and it's a real privilege to chair it for this amongst other reasons, 5 extraordinarily talented members with wide reputations, and it is a body which the members are all dedicated to making a difference rather than simply filling slots on a committee. So we're deadly serious, we're independent, and we're very much in business. We have 3 main objectives, and we've had our first meeting, we're about to have our second, and about to start translating these into outcomes and outputs. The first is that we have to report on when assets are being used, natural assets are being used unsustainably. The second is we have to be engaged in the exercise of embedding the natural environment, natural capital, into the heart of national income accounts and into the way the economy functions. And the third, which is very joined up with the first 2, is we have to advise the research councils on how monies should be spent. And I want to just spend a minute or so on each of those and then conclude within my time to keep our chairman happy. The task of reporting on unsustainable use of assets is an extraordinarily broad one. You might almost say a dangerous one, because at one level one might say, well, lots of assets are being used unsustainably, and one might spend one's time engaged in an enormous trawl through the characteristics of all our natural environment. And for a committee with limited time for its members, limited resources, this, of course, is impossible. But what we can do is play an extremely active role in taking forward the NEA and the asset check to make sure that there is in place the torch shining on what's going on, so that there is in place a methodology and a reporting process which enables us to see much more precisely what is truly, as I say, going on in our natural environment, and then to use the force of the Natural Capital Committee to put our weight behind highlighting where, if any, and wherever there are problems. So we have to take forward the NEA work, we have to take forward the asset check work, and we have to see that that's translated into meaningful, credible reporting. And then when the torch is shone on what's going on, it's very, very hard for people to shy away from those consequences. So that's very important, very difficult, and it requires a lot of scientific and ecological input. Economists have something to say about this, but that's where our scientific base is extremely important. The second, which is our long-term legacy, I hope, is embedding natural capital into the economy itself, and in particular into accounts. Mention was made of GDP plus, but actually I think that there's an argument one needs to go further. Governments don't have balance sheets, they have cash numbers to do with GDP. Environmental assets don't figure in these accounts, neither does their depreciation or their maintenance. If you don't know what you're doing to your assets, if you don't have an asset register, how the hell do you know what's going on? Rail tracks started off without an asset register, and look what happened. It took them quite a long time to work out where the trains were, where the assets were, and therefore what it needed to do about them. So we're engaged deeply with ONS and the statistical bodies in trying to bring to bear pressure, methodology, ideas, concepts to try to translate into action the ambition of having proper national income asset-based accounts. Never underestimate the challenge of that, but the target is 220, and I can assure you that my committee is putting its shoulder to the wheel. The third component is the research councils, and as I indicated at the beginning, this is very important because unless we have the research which looks at the assets, supports the asset check, supports the NEA, does the science, does the ecology, and indeed, in addition, does the economics properly, then we don't have the evidence base in which to make the best of the advice we give. So that's very important, though I won't spend any time on that today. So those are the things we're set about. We have one further fortunate characteristic, which is we're to be reviewed in 2014. I find that exceptionally good as a chairman, because we have to deliver by 2014 and we have to have a programme of producing outputs, advice and support, and to make a difference by 2014. Now that's well before 2020 and the green accounts, but I hope by that date that the role that my committee's played, and in my job as chairman, we will have made a significant difference and help to make the white paper not just an important white paper, but that significant turning point to getting the environment properly embedded in our economic life, in our accounts, in our practice, and with one very important point in mind: we actually want to make a difference to the natural environment. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me also thank the organisers for inviting me. I'm going to give a few personal perspectives, really, on the Lawton Review, the NEA, and the white paper, from my perspective, which is an academic ecologist, a practicing academic, still practicing, and one who's spent a fair amount of time, probably too much time, according to my head of department, working on these various papers and projects in recent years. So I think nature conservation has been a strong continuing tradition in England. It's one that we're well known for internationally. Over the last century or so, there were a number of visionary individuals and organisations, government and non-governmental, that pioneered protection and restoration of habitats and species, nature conservation. And we've been pretty good at it. There's no doubt that when a conservation priority or a restoration problem is recognised, and when the skill, resources and commitment have been directed to solving the problem, conservation works. And England can be rightly proud of what we've achieved. But having said that, I think the way that we've done conservation up until recently has some weaknesses, which makes nature conservation not fit for purpose going forward. And if you'll forgive me a few sweeping generalisations and some critical comments, I'm going to list what I think those are before moving on to why I think we should be in a better position now looking forward. So the first problem is that past successes in conservation have mostly been achieved piecemeal. Nature conservation areas have largely arisen through historical, rather ad hoc process. Areas and species were prioritised, mainly because there was a motivated group of people behind them, and the land area involved was not being used for something more pressing or more profitable. As a result, there was little coherence to the overall structure of the network of nature conservation areas that we now have. Secondly, we've generally been too negative. We tend to set conservation goals pretty low, to stop losing biodiversity so fast rather than to restore it. We failed to meet the 2010 goal to stabilise biodiversity in Europe. Internationally, we failed spectacularly to reach the CBD goal to reduce the rate of loss of biodiversity. And thirdly, conservation has been a poor relation compared to other land uses. Very often, the conservation of nature has been viewed as a luxury, one that we can't afford when times are hard or resources are limited. Conservation tended to be what you do when all the important stuff to do with food, water, infrastructure and energy had been taken care of. And even worse, conservation has often been outside integrated management planning and then become an obstacle to development plans. And I think these three kinds of weaknesses have a common root, that nature has been vastly undervalued. Now, finally, we're starting to appreciate how important natural capital is, how it's vital to current and future prosperity, just as economic and social capital is. So building on the work of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment early this century, new ways of valuing nature, managing ecosystems have been developed. And we now see that there are many potential ways to manage for a broader range of benefits and the ecosystem functions and services that are underpinned by biodiversity, as well as conserving biodiversity per se. So we now understand some new things. Firstly, the benefits that people derive from nature are essential and irreplaceable. Natural processes in the soil, in the air and the water bring us many benefits that we take for granted and receive at no cost. And they're all demonstrably supported by biodiversity and ecosystems. When all the benefits that people get from ecosystems are considered, not just the private benefits to a few, then loss of biodiversity and transformation of ecosystem generally also leads to irreplaceable loss of public benefits. So managing landscapes for any single resource that benefits only a few is simply going to be unsustainable in the future. At the same time, we've got a growing population with increasing demands for stuff of all kinds that's led to steep escalations in consumption and a consequent impact on the landscape. We cannot sustain nature and continue to convert more and more areas to meet this increasing consumption following business as usual strategies. Thirdly, the environment is changing. There's nothing new here. It's always changed. But nature conservation has historically been rather conservative. Retaining some kind of status quo has always been at the core of the movement. And now the environment is changing rapidly and perhaps at an increasing rate, not only because of growing demands from people, but also because of climate change, sea level rise, new pests, novel diseases and pollutants, all raining down on an already fragmented and depleted landscape. It's against this background that the various initiatives we're talking about here, the Lawton Report, Making Space for Nature, the NEA and the White Paper are so important. So Making Space for Nature, the Lawton Report, was a very refreshing and purposeful assessment that proposed a new goal for nature conservation, that England's ecological network should lead to a situation where, compared to 2000, biodiversity is enhanced, that the diversity, functioning and resilience of ecosystems be re-established in a network for nature that can sustain these levels into the future, even given continuing environmental change and human pressures. Essentially, the report recommended more, bigger, better, and joined-up areas that would harness the natural processes based in ecology, evolution, and the environment to support a sustainable natural environment and its services into the future. The NEA started at almost the same time and reported almost the same time in 2011. The NEA was a very bold attempt to assess the state of the UK's ecosystems and the services they support, looking backwards and forwards about 60 years. It focused more on ecosystem services, less on wild biodiversity, but it again emphasised the spatial context, and it made a first attempt at valuation. The NEA demonstrated the context dependency of many ecosystem services and the potential for different land management choices to support different benefits, singly or in combination, at alternative locations and different scales, and opened up to many people the possibility of very many different ways of managing and using the land and sea that would be more sustainable in future. The valuation work showed very clearly how ecosystem services have market values that can eclipse other services and benefits for which markets don't exist, despite them often being more valued and valuable. And inevitably, this situation leads to an overall depletion of natural capital, the work that Dieter Helmer's just mentioned. So these two messages were swiftly picked up and reflected in the Natural Environment White Paper. Very many people welcomed the clarity and vision of the White Paper, its central goal to mainstream the value of nature across society and to use a combination of these local nature partnerships, nature improvement areas, and reforms to the planning system to achieve change are absolutely consistent with the scientific findings in the Lawton Review and the NEA. The central mechanisms that are proposed in the White Paper, facilitating greater local action to protect and improve nature, creating a green economy, and strengthening the connections between people and nature, all address core issues. There are many excellent recommendations in the White Paper, but the element I think is absolutely core is to recognise the central role of natural capital in society and our economy. Finally, natural capital takes its place alongside produced human and social capital. So what of the future? These are all great plans, but the devil is in the detail and in getting them to work. Progress with nature improvement areas, about which we've already heard, has been close to spectacular. Following through and making the network coherent is going to be a challenge that will play out over the decades to come. There are some really significant nuances and subtleties here, where we're going to have to bring together the natural, social and political processes in a way that is at least coherent, but most importantly avoids conflicts and contradictions. Biodiversity, ecosystem services and nature conservation are not exactly the same things. They're different perspectives on a common problem. And the key to success lies at the social environmental science interfaces. The second phase of the NEA, now underway, is tackling some of these really hard questions to do with social values, valuation and scenarios. The NEA has been a world leader. No other country has undertaken such a thorough assessment. And the spatial approach to valuation is really innovative. There are really hard technical challenges, but it will be harder still when the theory has to be implemented on the ground with real land managers, landowners, and existing incentives, subsidies, and planning regimes. I think we're pushing at a rich seam here, but there is much to do, both in theory and in practice. And success will depend on good, adaptive policies and their implementation, sound science and evidence to provide guidance, and good governance at all scales, from local to national and international. But in turn, I think it also depends on a bit of a step change in environmental management in England that can't be achieved without society accepting that it is necessary, desirable, and achievable. And in that context, I'll end with a quote from the Lawton Report, which I think summarises this perfectly. And I can hear John Lawton saying this, actually. This will require strong leadership from government and a much better collaboration between local authorities, local communities, statutory agencies, the voluntary and private sectors, farmers, landowners, other land managers, and individual citizens. It will require education, explanation, and empowerment. It will also require resources, both money and people. It cannot be top-down and imposed, nor can it be entirely laissez-faire. It won't be easy, but it can be done. Thank you.
Some people will do anything to avoid Dieter Helms.
Well, I'm very sorry I missed Dieter, but I'm also sorry for being late. I risk sounding like Reggie Perrin if I say signalling problems at Grantham, but that was the absolute reason why I'm late. Thank you to Policy Exchange. You've probably already been thanked. If you haven't, big thank you, because you've been really important in making us in government think about water and about other environmental matters, and it's great that you're hosting this event today. You've heard about the big picture, about the economics, and about nature itself, and how what was in the white paper came through a lot of very useful thinking and very important thinking by John Lawton through the National Ecosystems Assessment and other pieces of work. But I want to talk to you today about people. The people in towns and cities and in the countryside, the people who are passionate about nature and who understand its value. This can be from the farmer who understands natural ingredients that are necessary for production and works to protect those natural building blocks of his business, to the volunteer who understands both nature's value and its fragility and devotes many hours to wilding an area in their local park, or the volunteer who I saw today in Tyneside, a group of volunteers working on the Riverfly project, getting real knowledge and expertise, which they are working with the Environment Agency on water quality and being able to give the Environment Agency warning when water quality deteriorates in a river system. That is a fantastic passion which is being directed in the right way. It's precisely what we tried to engage through the white paper. This passion, this knowledge, and this commitment for our natural environment is what we sought to harness. I want to talk about partnership in particular, because people are most powerful when they work together. One of the white paper's primary aims is to support partnerships that are already in existence and to cultivate more, because it's in partnership in our local area that we can really succeed in valuing, protecting, and enhancing our natural environment. While we were developing the white paper, this message came absolutely loud and clear to us. Effective action to benefit nature, people, and the economy happens when the right people come together in partnership. And from that message came our commitment to establish local nature partnerships and to support their development with a £1 million fund. This fund helped potential partnerships to explore how they might manage their local environment more effectively. This in turn generated 50 applications for formal recognition as local nature partnerships, and the vision, energy and commitment they displayed in these applications was wonderful. Really diverse partners, many coming together for the first time to work across geographic boundaries and, crucially, administrative boundaries, and finding innovative ways of pooling and sharing their limited local resources. And all of this driven by the ambition not only to safeguard nature, but to recognise its importance to economic growth and to the well-being of communities. And I think you've already heard that we are announcing that 41 partnerships are today earning official recognition as local nature partnerships, and I look forward to meeting them at a meeting later this summer. One of the things that we want local nature partnerships to do is to work with nature improvement areas, another commitment in the Natural Environment White Paper. We had a tremendous response to the nature improvement area competition, a total of 76 applications. Again, a really good mix of partners, farmers, of other local businesses, local authorities, national park authorities, and AONBs, conservation organisations, and community groups. In February, we announced the 12 winning NIAs, and in April they started work. I made it clear that this was just the start of our ambition, and I hope that these 12 will inspire others to follow. And that's why we've announced today that we'll be committing an extra £750,000 to support the proposals for the nearly 12, if you like, the next few, which we want to support going forward. And we'll be watching the progress of the 12 and hopefully, funds permitting, in the next spending round, we'll be able to see more. A solid example of the power of partnership. Again, diverse organisations coming together to work out how to reconcile growing more food with protecting the environment and coming up with a clear direction of travel. Their report tells us that we need to be ambitious, that we must capitalise on our geography and on our climate, and that we must build on our historic farming legacy of producing high-quality food competitively with high standards of animal welfare. And that at the same time, we must keep leading global environmental efforts whilst protecting our own valuable biodiversity and natural resources. As part of our drive to make agri-environment schemes more effective, the entry-level scheme will, from January next year, include new options for winter and spring food for farmland birds. With farmers' help, we'll be monitoring the impact these measures can have, and to turn around that steady decline in the farm bird index is one of our absolute priorities as ministers and as a department, and we are going to drive really hard to make sure that we are achieving that with people who manage the land, with people who mind about it, and with people who can work together with us in achieving that. There are 6 biodiversity offsetting projects, which, if you haven't heard about, they really are an exciting possibility for a net gain for the natural environment. We announced those last November. We had announced our water catchment pilots being hosted by the Environment Agency and other organisations. And we've also announced the Green Infrastructure Partnership, another white paper commitment that brought together nearly 250 organisations to help create better places to live and work. And we'll soon be seeing a whole new set of partnerships between schools and local communities. Recent surveys have shown the vast majority of our children are rapidly losing their connection with their local natural environments. And that is a tragedy. The pace of change is profound. The likelihood of children visiting local green space has fallen from 40% to 10% in a generation. Staggering. Undoubtedly contributing to the rise in childhood obesity and mental health issues, as well as a struggle to build a sense of place and a sense of community. The white paper called for every child in England to be given the opportunity to experience and learn about the natural environment. The Natural Connections demonstration project is part of the answer to that call. It will support schools to act locally, helping them to get children outside and learning about nature and the countryside. It will target schools that currently provide little or no learning in its natural environments, often schools in deprived urban areas. And it will support volunteers to help communities and schools form partnerships, ensuring all local skills and expertise are engaged. And I can tell you today that the University of Plymouth has been selected, subject to contract, to lead a range of partners to deliver this 3-year project, initially working with around 200 schools, so about 40,000 children and 2,000 school staff. And I'm pleased to announce that our department is providing £500,000 to help this very important project. And this on top of a bit of cross-government working, the Health and Safety Executive reducing their guidance to outdoor learning schools from somewhere around 100 pages to 8 is a major step forward, I think, for everybody concerned about this. I also want to announce the realization of another commitment in the white paper, if you haven't already heard of it from Caroline. We'll be providing £200,000 to help volunteering organizations build capacity to provide more opportunities for environmental volunteering. There are many passionate, energetic people out there crying out for such opportunities. Engaging them will help improve the quality of life in towns, cities, and the countryside, as well as the health of the natural environment. So a lot's happening, and of course there's much more to be done. I'm encouraged and inspired by some of the local work that I've been visiting, and these projects are springing up all around the country. I look around this audience and I see many people who've been involved in this process and advising government from various different directions about where we should be taking this. We are hugely grateful for that commitment. Please, it doesn't stop here. We've got a serious challenge as a society, not just to connect people with nature, but to repair nature to make sure it's viable and sustainable for the future. And it's working with people like you and organizations like Policy Exchange that we can make it happen. And so I hope that that continuing theme of partnership will be with us for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and we're almost on time. Who thought it? We have around 25 minutes for questions. I request that you identify which organisation you're from when you ask the question, and I also implore you to keep them as short as possible, because I'm sure we'll have many here. We'll take this gentleman here first, this gentleman on the front, and then the chap in the row there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Paul Cobbing from the National Flood Forum, but I'm particularly interested in your pronouncements recently on the future of the Statement of Principles and so on, but I'm also involved with Warwickshire Local Nature Partnership and in your constituency, Secretary of State, so I'm particularly interested in the announcements today on the progress of that. The question is, actually I think there's a level of ambition that we need to step up to that goes beyond some of the stuff we've been talking about. And if I can give just one example to illustrate that. A lot of people that I've been in contact with recently are people who, because of past decisions, whether it be from planning or otherwise, are flooded regularly and repeatedly will be flooded into the future. And that means that the insurance industry will either keep on paying out or they won't. So there's some strategic structural problems that we need to address. And I think we need to start thinking, instead of thinking just in terms of them being an insurance issue or a planning issue or a...
Get to a question, please.
Sorry, the question is, can we actually look strategically across sectors, environmental, economic and social, rather than just thinking this is a natural capital issue and take that forward in that way?
Okay, hold that thought. We'll take a couple more questions.
That's a big question, though.
I know it is, but we've got to get round.
Right.
Sorry, Crispin Tickell.
Yeah.
We heard some very good news today, and I think we all welcome it. But there is one little point which I wanted to bring. Particularly, I welcome GNP or GDP plus. But there is one phrase, one word used by politicians on all sides, which is growth. They say we must have growth. Now, what does growth actually mean? Because it means different things to different people. And for that reason, I hope the message that will emerge from today's meeting is that economists as well as politicians are brought in, and in particular, perhaps somebody could inform the Chancellor of the Exchequer that growth is not necessarily the right thing until we redefined it in the same way we've redefined other systems of economic measurement.
I'm sure he'll be abandoning growth very soon. I will take sorry.
Richard, as a former chairman of the Riverfly Partnership, I can attest to their enthusiasm all over the country. It's not just where you were today, but all over the country there are volunteers out there saving their rivers by going out because they love their rivers and they love the life in their rivers, even the little small life they find fascinating and interesting. And there's a real value on that, and that's why people are getting out there, why people care about the environment. The question is for Dieter, which is, you said, you seem to say you're forgetting about intrinsic and aesthetic values in your work, and you're just looking sort of at the use values. Maybe that wasn't the impression you meant to give, but I think that politically and publicly, these things are so intrinsically valued by people and given regard. The whole extinction debate is about that, that I hope that that is truly and properly reflected within the economic situation, as well as simply use.
Okay, yeah, so first question we'll take, Secretary of State, first question from Paul there.
Just in case no one in the room actually has heard this, we have found a way forward to deal with an unsolved problem of how you ensure that flood insurance remains universal and affordable. And it's really pertinent after the recent weeks that we've had, where an awful lot of people in different parts of the country have been flooded out, particularly because surface water flooding is very hard to deal with because it's so unpredictable. And that is an industry levy which goes into a pool to help people who are most prone to flooding. There's some details still to be concluded on it, but essentially that makes flood insurance universal and affordable going forward. And so that's incredibly important. But I'm sure related to your question is the one about the natural capital dimension of this. And I've seen amazing examples of using trees, for example, to slow the flow of fast-flowing water down steep-sided valleys that will just go on flooding. If you think of somewhere like the poor folks of Hebden Bridge, at the confluence of several steep-sided valleys there in the north of England, we need some natural capital approaches to helping them become more sustainable on top of any defences that we might build. But Richard may also have a dimension that he'd like to bring to that.
Well, funnily enough, Dieter and I were talking about this week and making sure that we don't sort of tinker under the bonnet of dealing with flood issues in a sort of, processy way, and actually every now and again just step back and say precisely what Caroline said, that this is a major economic issue. It is one where nature can provide a fantastic service if we get it right, and if we incentivize people in the right way, we can actually save the taxpayer money, we can protect homes and properties, but it requires a really strategic approach and just the better understanding that we have using organizations like yours and others about what the risks we face are. And so treating it as an ecosystem service, as something nature provides us, is precisely what we're trying to do.
Dieter, can you come on those two questions? One about the problems with valuing the intrinsic value of nature, but also that question about growth and whether growth itself is the problem.
Sure. Just to echo the point on ecosystem services, by looking at flooding in a much more holistic way, actually one can get much better outcomes for nature, probably at lower cost too. This is exactly the kind of thing where one wants to have an integrated analysis. I'm extremely sympathetic to that, and Richard and I were talking about that earlier this week. On the two other questions, I'm sorry, I may have misled you. On intrinsic and aesthetic values, I want in no way to diminish their importance in any sense of the word. What I was trying to do on the other side was be more modest about economic values. They're just part of this calculation. You see it in the independent panel on forestry. There's clearly much more there in terms of value in the deep sense than simply economic services. But I come at the other way. Since we're effectively not valuing the economic service at anything other than zero, we're making an improvement by incorporating, just as in the ecosystem service in the flood case, incorporating those into our concerns. But never think that when an economist talks about value, that exhausts the deep sense of value. It's one contribution, one further piece into the picture. And what economics is about resource allocation. And unfortunately, our resources are scarce, particularly our environmental resources. And choices and trade-offs have to be made. We don't spend money on preserving certain things, which we probably should. And what the economist is trying to do is something extremely limited. But please don't in any way think that the economics approach to this is complete or in any way diminishes those extremely important components. Just quickly on growth, you know, there's a great misconception amongst many in the environmental movement about economic growth. Economic growth is not GDP growth. It's quite a struggle to work out what the question is to which GDP is supposed to be the answer. Okay? I'd say that quite seriously. GDP is a cash-based number. Okay? It's cash in, cash out. The North Sea oil and gas revenues were cash in. There's no balance sheet. There's no asset and liability. What getting a better grip of accounting is doing is looking at the assets that lie behind our wealth in an inclusive wealth measure. And then we think about, for example, borrowing for investing rather than borrowing for consumption. We think about depreciation of assets. We think about capital maintenance of assets. Now, that's what proper green national income accounts are about. And since they're a million miles away from the right answer at the moment, each incremental step, and we're starting with forestry and building on the independent panel, is a step in that direction. But that doesn't imply that economic growth is a bad thing or we can't have economic growth. The ultimate driver of economic growth is technical progress, knowledge, ideas, concepts, inventions. And there is no slowdown whatsoever in the speed with which human ingenuity is adding to that. What you can't call economic growth is just asset depletion. And unfortunately, in conventional GDP, cutting down a bit of the Amazon rainforest shows up as a plus, and there's no minus on the other side of the balance sheet. That's what this is about. It's not an anti-growth exercise. It's a treating your assets and your balance sheet properly exercise. And it's boring and arcane in its detail, but it really matters.
Can I just come in on the back there, because it's incredibly important, which is what we're striving for here is sustainable growth.
Yes.
We've just gone through a period of unsustainable growth.
Yeah.
Terrible consequences, not just in our own country, but around the world. So what we need is sustainable growth going forward. And I think there are a couple of really important concepts that support that. One is resource efficiency. So, you know, in our period of unsustainable growth, we were resource inefficient in a very detrimental way. Defra's calculations are that if we put our economy onto a resource-efficient basis, we'd actually save it £23 billion a year, which is huge. And then the other thing, just to pick up on the innovation that comes with sustainable growth, if you take the whole waste industry and the recycling industry, it is one of the fastest growing industries at growth rates over 5% per annum right through this period of downturn. And constant innovations in new ways, new innovative ways to recycle those materials. So, you know, absolutely, government has decided to put sustainable development at the heart of government. It has been mainstreamed. The sole criteria on which planning decisions are now decided is on the basis of sustainable development. And that sustainability at the heart of the decisions that we make, you know, fueled by a better understanding of natural and social capital alongside economic capital, hopefully will underpin the kind of sustainable growth which is what we have to move the economy onto.
Okay, I'm going to take another. Sorry, there's questions.
We've missed one question.
No, I think we've touched on all of them.
Oh, right.
Yes.
No, but there was the one we
sorry,
hadn't about the rivers.
Rivers. And we'll take the chap in the. Sorry, I've got to take more questions. Stanley there, and then we'll take the chap there in the purple shirt, and then we'll take Peter just behind the camera. Thanks. Sorry. Try and keep it short, please, Stanley.
Very short. I'm Stanley Johnson. I used to apology for the line author. And by the way, apropos. Well, while things were, and it is apropos that. This is what I want to talk about. Ask you a question about sector estate. Yes, Rio wasn't so bad. And yes, the process of delivering sustainable development goals is interesting. But will you be ambitious? For example, just don't surely repeat the Nagoya targets, because if you look at it, Nagoya was itself a step back from the goals we had on biodiversity at the beginning of this century. At the beginning of this century, we said, let's reduce, let's halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And what does Nagoya say? Let's try and harvest. So can we have a really aggressive policy in the new setting of biodiversity goals? And I'm not right in thinking that our own Prime Minister has a part to play in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Then the chopping shirt.
John Stokes from the Tree Council. Trees have been mentioned, forests have been mentioned. But you were right, it's the devil in the detail. There's a lot of research in the States that has been done on upland catchment areas and rivers and stopping downstream flooding. There's even been research in South Wales by Defra on the value of a hedge. It can, planted across the slope can save 40% downstream flooding. So it's joined up, is the necessary part. But it's not just joined up in Defra, it's joined up across departments. Because we were with volunteers this morning who are on a South Coast local authority who have a subsidence claim against an oak tree, when the claim against that oak tree is £40,000. So how do you put an economic value on the tree, the devil in the detail, so that that doesn't become a tree versus 40 grand of insurance claim? And that's going to require a bit of joining up with DCL, not just Defra, because until you start to get the planners thinking about having trees as assets, it's going to be very difficult.
Okay, hold that. Phil, and then Peter, just behind me.
Hello, my name is Peter Hall. I'm a chairman of an ethical fund management company and also director of the International Rhino Foundation. My question is about global biodiversity, and I just want to try and get an insight into the political process by which we assign resources to the problem. Secretary of State, you said that we were in the middle of the sixth great extinction. I think in the year before the Conservative Party and Liberal Democrat coalition government came to power, we spent £51 million on global biodiversity. Congratulations to Richard Benyon for doubling the Darwin Initiative's budget, and congratulations to you for increasing rainforest spending. But how do we get this in proportion? We're spending £51 million on the sixth greatest extinction, and we're spending £8 billion on international aid, £100 billion on national health, etc., etc. What is the process by which we get that into balance?
It's coming back. So working back from that question, so the reason why the UK has been asked onto this high-level panel with India prior to the meeting in Hyderabad is because we're one of the very few countries can hold its head up, developed countries, and say we will meet the target, the UN target, to spend 0.7% of GNI on overseas aid. But the way we spend it now is a smarter way of doing it, which is to say you can achieve the multiple outcomes of poverty eradication, reduced deforestation, and protecting and enhancing biodiversity if your project is delivered to meet the multiple objectives. And we've got examples of really good projects now in the Cerrado in Brazil, which have demonstrated that you can achieve all three things. So we can mobilize quite a lot of the 8 billion that you put your finger on, in pursuit of trying to halt the loss of biodiversity. But in addition to that, when the coalition came in, it set aside, despite hard times, 2.9 billion for an international climate fund. Now, this money can be used in the same way to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss at the same time. By the kind of intervention you make, you can address both these things. I think you have to agree with me that significant resources, and why we're on that high-level panel, is because we're there for encourager les autres, yeah? To encourage the others. And hopefully, you know, with the hosts India, we'll get more people to sign up to that approach, putting significant resources behind reducing the loss of biodiversity, because it's linked to the key challenges of climate change and poverty eradication. And whilst I'm on high-level panels, I can quickly mention the Prime Minister, Stanley, is on Ban Ki-moon's high-level panel on the post-2015 framework. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed in principle at Rio last month, have to be in place at the same time as the post-2015 framework. That's what we've agreed to. These are universal. They're going to cover all countries, and the themes have yet to be agreed, but we're pushing very hard from a UK perspective. The themes should be water, energy, food, big challenges. And they have to, the goal has to be as neatly defined as the Millennium Development Goals were, to drive the action of the kind that we've seen with the Millennium Development Goals. But having our Prime Minister on that high-level panel should give the UK an opportunity to give that, you know, real support. And I know we can rely on him to do that.
Richard, do you want to go on the planning?
Just on the tree. You're bringing it right down from the high-level conversation to something very local. I think you're absolutely right, and it's rather linked to that question about rivers, because we sort of hardwired this concept of sustainable development into our planning system, and we've now got to make that work. So it can't just be words, it's really got to work at a local planning level. And if we are pushing powers down to local communities to set their neighbourhood plans, they are worried about that tree in a way that a district or a county or national government, can't be so concerned. So I can't help thinking that this is a real bonus for the people who want to use nature as a protection, whether it's for flood protection or as a barrier for noise or to increase biodiversity. And it's linked to the point on rivers. Just two very quick points. Firstly, when we've talked about rivers in the past, we think of it as the waterway, as that channel of water, which of course is such a myopic way of looking at it. It's the ecosystem, it's the whole catchment, and our catchment approach, in one sense, is going through a very processy thing of complying with a water framework directive. I mean, how unambitious is it to do it because you just want to comply with the directive? We want to comply with it because people are absolutely passionate about their river, whether from an informed point of view, like the Riverfly project, or whether from just people who mind about seeing supermarket trolleys or just not seeing the life that they used to see in the river when they were young. And it's just trying to engage at that level and making a real difference alongside government commitment, Environment Agency, working with organisations like landowning groups, farmers, and what have you, to engage on the problems. So it's a complete picture, that sort of holistic view of it, which is the way to get.
Richard, do you think local authorities get, they're under lots of spending pressure, lots of other pressures and commitments? Do you think they understand this in the planning system, that these decisions?
It's not optional not to, because the planning system has been changed. So it may take people, sorry, I shouldn't be answering this.
What she said.
I have the advantage of doing the local government brief for 6 years, and we believed in the localism because we wanted to return power right back down to the level where people have that sense of having more ownership of what happens around them. So all the local authorities have got to get used to the new presumption in favour of sustainable development and work it through in their local plans. But I don't know about you, Richard, but I go around the constituency talking to the villages about the importance of having their neighbourhood plan, because their neighbourhood plan supersedes even the local authority plan and has to have sustainable development at its heart. So it makes you rethink, where should the houses go? What do we need to sustain life in this village, in this town? We need adequate green space. We need enough water to supply the community. And it's a completely fresh way of looking at it. And I think it will take time for them all to get their heads around that. But the point is, the lever has been pulled. It's enacted in law. And that is, I think, a really important thing for all of us to seize hold of.
Georgina, do you want to comment on that?
I can just make a quick comment on extinction rates, as that's come up. So I think it was bold, but probably rather naive, to set the CBD goals, to think that we could reverse the rate of extinction in a period of 5 or 10 years. That was just never going to happen. There's huge inertia in the processes that are driving species extinctions. Actually, the best way to deal with it now, given that we have many wild species that are also going to be wanting land and sea area that many more people are using, is to get these integrated policies on the ground. I think that's the only way that we can affect the extinction rate, and it's going to take decades to see success. But there is a way to do that, so long as we don't try and partition food over here, species over there, water over here, etc.
Absolutely right.
Okay, I'm going to take another round of questions. Take the lady there, the second row, and then the chap right there. I'm sorry. I'm going to get lynched.
Sue Whitstone from Bioregional. So you spoke about the analogy of 10 years ago, everybody was getting their head around carbon and climate change, and you see natural capital as the same thing. And when we account for our carbon emissions, we don't take into account our carbon consumption in the current system. And the Secretary of State talked about, I think it was you, Caroline, who said about the Amazon tree goes on the GDP. But obviously it's going on the, it's going on the Brazilian accounts. So I just wondered, how will we avoid exporting our natural capital consumption in much the same way that we currently export our embodied carbon consumption, and how will we account for it in our national accounts in 2020?
Okay, hold that thought, Peter. Just second row, Chapman.
Yes, Bob Bloomfield from Natural History Museum. So we're all sympathetic towards moving to an ecosystem service approach. But we've seen at an international level in Rio that a large part of the G77 are very suspicious that this is to do with commodification and transferring monetised biodiversity. At a local level, and enormous people who are involved in conservation are very suspicious that these new mechanisms, which are to do with monetary value, have ulterior motives. My question is around recognising the diversity around, I'm not questioning the direction, I'm all for it, but I think there's a big gap in understanding at the moment as to where this is going and what initiatives there are to build trust. Because I think if we're looking at a 10-year progression, that process, looking into the education system, for example, in terms of how any of these ideas are currently embedded in young people's learning, and how we look at our broad public, if they're going to give you a mandate for the next 10 years in the voting system, how are they going to be more aware of this imperative and the direction of travel and the motivation which is behind it?
Okay, and then the chat.
James Calder from Concern for Chilterns and Countryside. My question is, how do we reconcile valuing nature and protecting nature with a project like HS2? Is there some more environmental mitigation, for example, like a tunnel all the way through the outstanding area of natural beauty, or is it other measures?
I'll start with Peter and then I'll come back. That's all right.
Okay, so the
first two,
on the carbon consumption of the biodiversity and other consumption is an incredibly important point. Since you can have an advert for your book, I've just finished my book on the carbon crunch, and you look at a country like the UK, 1990 to 2005, carbon production falls 15%, but carbon consumption goes up 20%. And you look at on the climate change front, emissions haven't fallen at all, despite the apparent fall of carbon production. But in Europe, why? Because we're importing the energy-intensive, carbon-intensive goods that we used to produce domestically. This tells you not that this is a hopeless exercise. This tells you you've got to be really careful what you measure. This is about shining the torch on what's really going on. And in carbon, we're interested in the carbon footprint, which is carbon consumption, not carbon production, which is what Kyoto is about. And when we look at biodiversity, of course, this forces it to be an international issue. It's no good having wonderfully sustainable timber production in Britain and then importing something which is really not attractive. But that's about doing it properly. And I cannot emphasise how that makes the carbon issue and the biodiversity issue international by definition. And that's why the global approach to environmental accounting is not just about doing the accounts for each individual country. It's like balance of payments. You have to trade them out. So I cannot stress how important that is, but if I can give you one consolation, I'm on to that one, right? Okay, on the ulterior motives, this is really important. The misunderstanding about what environmental valuation, particularly by economists, is all about is perfectly understandable. If people think that when valuation is done by economists, they're actually saying something is worth X. This down is worth £462,562, whatever. That's not what it's about. And we have a real education job to explain. It's about resource allocation. And only one component of the decision about how to allocate resources is, are you doing it efficiently? And are you really valuing the component parts of that? And you might not like this answer, and you might think this is a cop-out. But since we're doing it so badly now, by giving so little value to these assets, even a step in the right direction is going to make, I think, a difference. And think about the carbon example. If you don't have a carbon price or a carbon value, we're not saying carbon's really worth that, our climate's really worth that number. But we're saying, once you put a value on something, then you cannot simply dismiss it and you have to take it seriously. And in that sense, the economist role, the accounting role, the economic valuation is modest, but in a context in which we are giving no value at the moment so often, and nobody can be satisfied with the outcome we've got. So it's like my answer to the intrinsic value question earlier. Don't think economists have the answers to these questions. What economists have and what scientists working with economists and the Natural Capital Committee can contribute is one part of the answer, one further contribution. And modesty is really important here. The Natural Capital Committee can't solve all these problems. We can make one small contribution going that direction. But I say to any environmentalist who says, you can't put an economic price on the environment, it's priceless. Well then what do? Do we devote all of national income to something that's priceless? We have to make decisions, hard decisions, and they should at least be informed by natural capital considerations, but not determined by.
Georgina, do you want to comment on that point? Are you uncomfortable at all about, because lots of people in conservation are uncomfortable with this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's becoming an issue that the terminology is becoming a hindrance to making progress in some of this. And some people don't like ecosystem services, some people don't like valuation. I actually think those different communities, the conservation people, the land use managers, the resource users, share more overall goals than the language they use suggests. And I'm not wedded to any of this terminology, but I think if we can get to the conceptual understanding of what we're trying to achieve, which is basically around sustainable land use and sea use, then I think it'll get easier. So it's the words more than the concept, I think.
So, to quote Deidre, this is probably not an answer that you're going to like. In my experience, if somebody doesn't like high speed 2, they won't accept usually any of the explanations that are given, but let me try. So the main problem is we've got a lack of capacity now on the main railway lines. What the Victorians always envisaged, they envisaged a Grand Central Railway, and anyone who lives along the line of route, if you go to the land registry, the route of the Grand Central Railway has always been there. Now, the route of high speed 2 is the one largely that we inherited, and this is the position. There's been a huge increase in rail travel. There are a variety of reasons for that. Right against the trend with declining economic activity, we're seeing an increase in rail travel because the price of petrol is increasing and set to continue rising. And people are using railways for their long distance journeys because it is more economic for them to do so and using their cars for shorter distances. And the reason we want to support rail travel is that on the whole that is beneficial to the environment. And in particular, high speed rail will reduce the attraction of short haul flights. Remember that high speed 2 is designed in a Y shape that goes basically supports the capacity along the West Coast main line, then splits to service Manchester and Leeds and beyond. And what one is trying to do is create a fast enough train journey that people won't then take a short haul flight from Manchester or Leeds to London. That was the pattern of behaviour on the continent where high speed 2 has been introduced. So reducing short haul flights, getting people to leave their cars at home, but also getting freight off the road. There is no spare capacity for freight on the West Coast main line. It's been moved onto the Chiltern line, exhausting the spare capacity on the Chiltern line, and whichever way you go, we're short of capacity, and it's a capacity problem that the government of the day, it happens to be us at the moment, have to consider how will our children and their children move around, and their products and services be moved around in a resource-constrained environment. So obviously there is an environmental impact, there is, and that is why mitigation is now the stage of the government activity, and I for one support a deep bore tunnel through my own constituency. I am affected, it comes straight through, and deep bore tunnel obviously proposed through parts of the Chilterns, and other mitigating measures. There's more than one type of mitigation. But ultimately there will have to be significant biodiversity offsetting as well, which is where a proper assessment of the natural capital loss needs to be into the equation of how we make sure we have really adequate offsetting to deal with where we can't mitigate. So it is not an easy decision by any means. Very, very difficult. And it's going through your constituency. Believe you me, it's difficult. It is difficult. But I have to look at the underlying drivers, which are lack of rail capacity and the need to provide a more sustainable form of transport, not just for our own generation, but for subsequent generations.
Just on development as a whole, I think regardless of the rights and wrongs of any particular scheme, and I've got a public meeting in my constituency tonight where people will say to me, "You're the Environment Minister, how can you not oppose this, or why can't you support us on that?" And the point is that development will happen. It's what you do with it, and it's by an understanding of the impact it is having and how you can mitigate that impact that then you can have both growth, in however you choose to describe it, and development and a sustainable natural environment. And it's a question, just as the local issue of development of new houses on the edge of a village or large-scale development like this, it is about how you understand the impact and how you mitigate it. And it's linked to the question from Bob about public conception. I mean, you have a thick skin when you go into politics, but one bit of criticism we got about this white paper was from one organisation, I don't know whether they're here, who said, dismissed the whole white paper and said, what is the government trying to do? Trying to get a monetary value of a badger over an otter, I think was the quote that they used. And this was a renowned green NGO. And I tried to talk it through with them, but I understand there is very real concern. They think that this is some sort of right of centre approach to economics, and this is a flint-faced accountant's approach to the environment. Absolutely, this is something that can embrace the whole political spectrum, and has to, because it is, as Dieter says, so much more fundamental and important. And what do we do if we don't do this? That is the key point. Do we just carry on a sort of cash basis in the way we have? Disaster would ensue. So I think we've got it right. Just the last word.
Yeah, I've been told that was the last question because we're running out of time, but I didn't want to finish without saying something really important about the Natural Environment White Paper. Huge amount of work went into that by Defra officials, and I'm sure that Richard would agree with me that we're incredibly well served at Defra by really dedicated civil servants who really do care that we get the decisions right. We've put a huge amount of work into this, and I think it's absolutely right to say that in public. Because all too often politicians take the credit without giving the due, and I think it's really right, I should say in front of all of you, obviously very knowledgeable, care just as passionate we do. What a good job was done by officials.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we're going to have to end it there. I know there was more questions. Can I just say that I look forward to the day when the report of the Natural Capital Committee gets as much attention as GDP figures, but we'll know we've made some progress by that point. But I'd just like you all to thank you all and to thank our panel.